Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Shack. And if you're a regular viewer, you'll have witnessed my little love affair with the Amstrad CPC 464, as I reminisced over this machine that was so present in my life during my teenage years. And you may also have seen the episode where we looked at the Amstrad NC 100 and where I wondered if that machine had been a little kickback at Sinclair's Z88 portable. Well, with me today, albeit virtually, is Cliff Lawson, who can hopefully answer those questions and a few others, as he has the distinct claim to fame of being Sir Alan Sugar's first real apprentice, having worked directly with Alan at Amstrad for a little over 24 years, and who was involved in practically every computer project undertaken at Amstrad during that time. Through the acquisition of Sinclair and the eventual sale of Amstrad to B Sky B, and he must have been doing something right because he never heard those immortal words, "You're fired." It's a real pleasure to have you on the show, Cliff, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Scott.
I suppose we should really start right at the beginning. I mean, how did the job at Amstrad come about?
Yeah, well, I've got a twin brother, and we grew up sort of playing with electronics and things. It all started actually when my parents bought us a sort of wiring kit with like bulbs and switches and things. Got interested in that, then started making hobby projects. That was so interesting, and there was the dawn of the computer age, Altairs and that sort of thing started to appear. So I got really interested in computers. So I actually went to university and did a degree. Well, it's funny, the degree I did, it was called just electronics and computing, and no one was particularly interested. So the following year, they renamed it microelectronics and microprocessor applications. And they were overwhelmed with applications, and I was one of the ones who applied to that. So I did that for 3 years at Newcastle's. I'm actually Geordie, so in Newcastle University, we're in the electronics department. So it's a split degree between electronics. There was actually, we did all sorts of weird things like X-ray crystallography and things, because it's all about material structure and things. It was actually about how you make silicon chips and things. So that was all really interesting stuff. And this was 81 to 84. I've had my first job was just something in the local paper where they were looking for people to program COBOL, and so I went applied for that job, got the job, went on the sort of 3-month training course, whatever it was, and learned COBOL. Only I think they claimed I was a little bit disruptive because I kept on questioning, because I'd been taught structured programming methods and Pascal and Algol at university. Looking at COBOL, it just looked like the weirdest, stupidest layout of language imaginable. So I questioned that, and so I didn't start that job. So then I was going to start a job with a company programming Forth. My third year project at university had been implementing Forth on things like PDP-11s and stuff. And so I actually got a job with a company in the UK that was actually one of the major developers of Forth. And I was about to start that, except that 1 week in October, I got the Computer Weekly magazine, because I lived in Romford in Essex, and Amstrad's new computer department were just like 4 train stops up the line in Brentwood. So I saw an advert saying there was a job in Brentwood with this company Amstrad who'd only just started. The 464 was out at that stage. It was released in 83, but they weren't sort of heavily into computers. But I thought that would be really interesting. So I applied. I went along on the Friday afternoon and had an interview with the infamous, the very famous Roland Perry. And I think obviously it helped that I'd got a degree in microelectronics and microprocessor applications. So, but also, I remember he sent me a little sort of entrance test and gave me a copy of the CPC 464 firmware manual that I'd never seen before. And he basically said, oh, if you wanted to read some characters on the keyboard and output them on the screen, how would you achieve that? So I had to flick through the manual, found the relevant calls in the API, and explained to him how I'd do it. He said, okay, well, do you want to start Monday? So that was it. So unfortunately, I had to tell the Forth people that I wasn't going to take their job. And so I started the following Monday with Roland and doing 464 stuff.
It's interesting you mentioned COBOL because, again, showing my age, I remember at when I went to college, we were programming in COBOL, and it was actually written on paper. We had to write on structured COBOL
Yeah, well, I
programs.
remember that with those little grids. Yeah. That's exactly how we were doing it.
Can you tell us about the first project you worked on at Amstrad?
Yeah, so what I was originally taking, I mean, obviously, I think one had the idea that I would sort of join the kind of programming and development team of things, but obviously to kind of get me into the thing, I actually did 464 end user support. So we had quite a big customer support department, and if someone said, "Oh, the rubber band in my tape recorder's snapped" or something, there would be people to deal with that. But the questions were like a hierarchy, and they got up to really technical questions. So there were people like that firmware guide asking. I even remember this day, and this is almost 40 years ago. The entry point to put a character on the screen, I think it is BB5A. These sort of things stick in my mind, and so, or you'd have people asking, how does the Z80 LDIR opcode work, or something like that, and I used to live with a copy of Rodney Zach's Z80. It was the Z80 Bible, and I just sort of, over time, I became extremely proficient in Z80 assembler, because I then did it for 15 years at Amstrad, because almost all the following projects were Z80 based until we got into the x86 stuff. But then Roland sort of said, "Oh, look, we've got this happening. Do you want to sort of like write a test program to test this out?" Or we did. There was this add-on box that clipped on the back of the 464, which had an RS-232 serial interface, and it had like, I think, was it Presto we did in it? It was like a bulletin board service, but it was on a 40 by 25 screen. And so we did that. And I had colleagues that we were working with, so there's Dave and Vic and people that, as a group, we took on these little projects. And over time, things got bigger and more complex projects. Meanwhile, the 464 was out, and so the 664 was done, and obviously all that did was add a disk drive on the end of the machine. Then did the 6128, and that got a little bit more complex because it had bank switch memory and things. So Roland actually did the bank switch software on that, but there was various aspects of that I got involved in. And then, of course, it snowballed on from there. So into PCW 8256 and the whole of the PCW development. I got heavily involved in font translations, because people think, oh, all these CPC 464s and 8256s and things, that they were just for the UK market. But actually, the largest market for the 464 was France. So doing French translation of everything, and especially the main issue when you move from one Euro country to another, like Italy, Spain, is the keyboard layout. Germany, of course, AZERTY. So you have to do all the keyboard translation tables so that to arrange that when you push a certain key, the right character appears on screen. So there's all that sort of stuff that we were doing as well. So
it's interesting because the CPC 464 I've mentioned on the channel a few times was my second computer, having graduated. I use the term graduated. I don't want to upset anyone, but it graduated from a Spectrum, and I loved it. I mean, I think it's a remarkable machine. But I postulate, did Amstrad plan it to be a remarkable machine? I mean, was it we'll take the market on and give them this wonderful machine, or was it just a load of parts that were flung together and luckily it worked?
Well, there's quite a sort of interesting story to this. There's a book that was written by ghostwritten by Alan Spittle, that is an autobiography of Alan, and it explains the whole of this story. But so if anyone wants to read that in real detail and find out exactly what happened, read that book. But here is a brief summary of what happened. So the way a lot, not just for the 464, but in subsequent years, the way a lot of Amstrad products came about was that Alan would go each year. He would go either to the Far East, Japan, because and People's Republic, Hong Kong, and things, and he'd see new electronic devices that hadn't made it to Europe yet over there, or he'd go the other way. He owns quite a big place in Florida. And so he'd go across to Florida for a month or two. And when he was there, he'd see things and think, blimey, that looks interesting. I wonder if we could make one of those. So he saw the Commodore 64 that way. And so he came back and basically said, well, could we make a Commodore 64 work alike? But yeah, just to get a fraction of that market. And so they found some external guys who said, yeah, sure, we can design you a 6502 based home computer with, color pixels. I don't know if they promised sprites or anything, but just basically a color home computer. And so they employed these guys. One of them was a hardware designer guy, and the other was a software developer guy who was obviously going to write a BASIC and things. And so they set to work on that. As they developed it, they came back and said, right, this is, for instance, what we're going to need on the keyboard. So they gave the kind of layout and the color of the keyboard and things. So we're going to have this, there's a key on the keyboard that's like a vertical bar symbol, and in later, pipe. And when you plugged on like a ROM pack or something, you would access the commands on that ROM pack by using that pipe symbol. Well, that symbol got used later on because there was no actual use of it. They'd specified it on the keyboard, but there was no particular need for it. So anyway, these guys, they were working on the design. They were specifying, obviously, for manufacturing, you've got to buy in kits of parts, and you've got to start doing the plastic injection molding of the cabinet and things. You've got to get all those things rolling early on in the project, because some of those things take a long time. Meanwhile, these guys were sort of supposedly working away, only as it got to each sort of deadline, like, can you see a demo of this? It was getting less and less likely, until after they'd been paid quite a lot, I think, these guys disappeared off, went completely off the grid. And in fact, they were traced by use of a credit card in the Lake District or something. And so anyway, it was a non-project. They hadn't succeeded in making either a BASIC or a circuit board and a design for this thing. In the team at the top of Amstrad, there was a guy called Stan Mandel who was kind of in charge of logistics, but he was also radio ham. And if anyone remembers back to like the early 80s there, if you got a copy of Practical Electronics or what was the other ones? Everyday Electronics, those magazines, you would find adverts in there for a company called Ambit, and they principally sold you kits for making like hi-fi amplifiers and things, and they were run by a guy called William Pole in a little shop behind Brentwood High Street. And so Stan Randall, because he was a radio ham, he bought electronic stuff for them. So he contacted this guy, William Pole, and said, oh, do you know anyone who does computers and stuff, like could help us out with the design of a computer? Well, William went to Brentwood High School, but he went there with another guy called Roland Perry. And so he knew, because Roland had just been at Cambridge, and so he knew he was interested in computers and stuff. So he contacted him and said, oh, could you help us out here? Now, Roland was at Cambridge, and he was there with, I think, I'm not sure which of them were actually at Cambridge, but there was Chris Hall and Richard Clayton, who were the two leaders of locomotive software. And there was Mark Eric Jones, or everyone called him Medge, who was the guy who did the electronic design. And so Locomotive were already writing Z80-based word processing software. We'll come to that later on. And so they also had a BASIC. They had Locomotive BASIC, or Mallard BASIC. And so they said, oh, we could make a machine that could do this, but unfortunately it can't be a 6502. Our specialization is Z80. So if you would allow Medge to make us a Z80 hardware platform to run this on, we'll bring our BASIC onto this. And of course, to run that BASIC, they needed an underlying API, like an OS, to run it on. So they also wrote the firmware for the board that Medge designed. So in only, I forget the timescales, but a very short number of months, they went from nothing to a board design and an implemented firmware on top of which was implemented Mallard Locomotive Basic. And that was the solution. And so the thing is, they then had to put it into that cabinet that the earlier guys had sort of specified, even though it didn't have the keys they particularly wanted. So they found uses for some of the keys and things. And there it was.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? It might answer the question why the Amstrad board always looks very spaced out. If you look at an Amstrad PCB, it is very, it's not dense. And I wonder if that's because originally it was designed for a completely different profile.
I don't know for sure. The problem, of course, with PCB is because it's copper clad, you pay per square inch. So the bigger the board, the more it costs. And so for economic reasons, you actually always want to try and make the circuit boards as small as you can. But you could well be right that if the plastic moulding for the actual cabinet had already got mounting holes, maybe they just said, oh, well, we need the board to be that big for that. But I couldn't say for sure if that's the case, but it could well be.
I think the Amstrad will always have a soft spot in my heart, and I always saw it as kind of the spiritual successor to my Spectrum, even though it's a completely different stable. But of course, we all know that eventually Sinclair was purchased by Amstrad. And how did Amstrad's purchase of Sinclair affect the company's direction?
Yeah, to be honest, actually, it was, I think it was just like a sales thing that Alan presumably thought that by badging things Sinclair, because it's known. I mean, by this stage, when was it? 85 was that? I can't remember.
Yeah, I think it was about 85, 85.
I mean, the Spectrum had obviously been out. Well, it had been the ZX80, ZX81, then the Spectrum, and so there was a history of people trusted Sinclair for like home computer design. And so I think Alan just thought maybe that he'd get more of the share of the market by also having units in under the Sinclair brand. So I don't think he didn't buy it because he was being altruistic and sort of like helping out an old mate or something. I think everything Alan ever did was based on how much money is he going to make him or him and his shareholders. So I think it would done for that reason. The 464 and then 664 and then 6128 were already either established or becoming established. So it wasn't like we needed to kind of, we had to buy in something because they were failing or something. It was just to widen the portfolio so that you could have I mean, let's face it, even then, I can't remember the exact price, but was it about 349 or something for a 464 or maybe a 6128 or something?
It was 249 for the mono and 349. And I the reason I know this, Cliff, is because my parents couldn't afford the color one. So I got the green screen one because it was under the £250 limit that I had.
Yeah. So I mean, obviously those are still pitched. Like think of what 350 quid was in those days. I mean, be what you might think was, I don't know, 700, 800 quid's worth these days. So it's quite an investment. So I think another aspect of it is, I thought if we could have a sort of entry level models at the lower, then you could get that many more people buying your equipment. And so like that would have been the attraction of it. And then, of course, we did the +2, which was basic. Obviously, the trick of putting the tape drive on the end of a 464 to make it reliable, and so you didn't have all that fiddling around with trying to wire up the right cable and things, and your own cassette deck not running at quite the right speed, and all those problems. You could have a much more engineered tape deck if you put it on there yourself. So the +2 was just a natural development of the +128, of the Spectrum 128. It was just to take that and then stick a tape drive on the end of it. And so, but then obviously that then rolled on into the +3 and the +2A. The +3 being the next obvious step, which was to put one of our disk drives, our funny little 3-inch disk drives, on the end of it, and then to wind that back and make the tape version of that, but with all the extra bits that we've added at that stage. Yeah, so I mean, these things, there were effectively parallel development. So there was the established 464 line, so 464, 664, 6128, and then there was this parallel Spectrum line to try and effectively get a bit more of the lower end of the market. So we sold more units. That's what it always was about, was trying to make money.
Well, there's nothing wrong with making money, that's for sure. I know that the one of the things the Amstrad gets recognised for, even today, is the, should we say, quirky colour scheme that it had, which, you know, personally, I think I used the word garish in the video, which I think you recoiled at. But
oh, that was my NC100 you were having a go at.
Yeah, well, the NC100 is an interesting one because I know it's a particular pride and joy. You're particularly proud of that machine, and I loved it when I did the review of it and the teardown. I thought it was great. We reviewed it on the channel last year, and I did perhaps rudely suggest that it was inspired by Cambridge Computer's Z88, which came out a few years previous to that. Was that the case, or did the idea originate elsewhere? You know,
no. So, I mean, also, like, you've got to look at the timeline development of this. We'd had the 464s that then we wanted to break into the business market. So we came up with the 8256, which was basically a word processing computer, but we gave the printer and everything in an entire package. And but then the world was starting to look at portable computing. And I mean, the idea of being able to just take a device out and make some notes while you're at, maybe go to a meeting, take some notes. There were various devices on the market. Now, most of these were coming out of Japan. There is a device called Tandy WP100, I think it is, which is, if you look at it, you think, oh, blimey, is that an Amstrad NC100? No, it isn't, because it's got rather a classic design rather than got garish coloured keys on it. But it was the same sort of concept. It was that same letterbox LCD display, and then a device that you could create documents on and then bring them back. That's where the NC100 came from. I mean, Alan, again, it's this thing where he would go to the Far East, he would see devices and think, oh, we haven't got that in England. Like, if we can make those ourselves, we could make a killing on these things. So he'd seen these things. Now, it just so happened that with the PCW 8256, there was then a PCW 9256, and that was the same thing, but instead of a dot matrix printer, it had daisy wheel printer. And the company that made those was a Japanese company called Nakajima. And so when we talked to Nakajima about this, oh, we're thinking of doing this portable thing, they said, oh, we've got one of those. And so we worked with Nakajima to take their design, but it wasn't quite right for what we wanted to do. So we took their design, told them how we wanted it changed. We also wanted to change all the cabinet and the keys, the dreadful coloured keys. And so we instructed them on that. And I project managed that to get them to make that device. I already knew the success of ProText from Arnor on the CPC. So I contacted Mark, and I can't remember the guy's name, at Arnor, and I asked them, could you do a version of your ProText on this device we're making? So that's how that came about. Equally, we wanted to put BASIC in it. And so I shopped around, and Richard Russell, who'd written the part or been involved in the development of the BASIC for the Acorn Atom, had then gone on to produce BASIC for other things, including the Z88. And so I went along to him and said, oh, could you port that BASIC into this machine we're doing? And so we made an arrangement, and he did that.
I think I need to give us both a bit of a break. We'll have a little sip of water. While we're doing that, we'll let our lovely viewers watch an advert. So we'll be back shortly. Whilst people were away watching the adverts, I was obviously typing up my notes on my lovely Amstrad NC100 here, which is a fantastic machine. I love it, and it's it's a very tactile machine. I think it's of an era. There's no doubt it's of an era, but it's a fantastic machine. I wondered if there were any ideas you had at the time that didn't make it into the NC100.
Yeah, again, yeah, it's all because Alan kept on seeing devices and thinking, couldn't we have a piece of that action? So, I mean, there were Game Boys and things around that time. And because we were already making a portable machine, he said, wouldn't it be great if we could put like a platform ladders, you know, Mario-y kind of game into the MC100? And so we thought we could put a platform ladders game in it. And I actually employed a new guy called Brian, who worked with me for years afterwards, with the intention that he would concentrate on just writing and get a platform ladders game for it. The only thing is, and I know this now because I've done an awful lot of this stuff over the years, but the fact is that the screen on the MC100 is called Super Twist Pneumatic, and it's a form of liquid crystal where to switch a pixel from the on to the off state takes 200 milliseconds, which means you can only change it 5 times in a second. But for a fast-moving platforms ladders kind of game, I mean, you even saw that in the Game Boy. Sometimes when things were moving, it all kind of went a bit blurry, but they had a much faster switching LCD than we had. So that means you want a screen to update at least 15 times a second, preferably 30. And these days, people look for 60 or 120. But certainly to get sort of fluid motion, you need to be updating the screen at least 15 times a second, which just isn't technically possible on that screen. So it was never going to work. And so we went through this whole long development and we got all the mechanics and sprites and things working. And Alan was getting concerned about it. So what we actually did was we went to the local job centre and just said, oh, could we employ some people just for a day to like bung 50 quid each or something, to just come and give us an opinion of what they think of what we've got so far. And they all came, so I had this room full of people and we presented this thing to them, and to a man or a woman, they all said it was utter and just don't do it. So that never happened. So the only thing is, I think I was working on the NC150, which was an Italian version of the NC100 at the time. And we'd even put a legend on one of the keys for game. So there had to be a game. And we were getting close to the software deadline. So almost literally overnight, I wrote a version of Tetris that I called Blockade. And I put that into that machine. And then that then appeared in the MC200 as well, in a sort of like a widescreen version of it. But yeah, that was one of the big plots that failed. I mean, as for other things we might have put in there, I mean, if you just think of modern mobile phones and all the things you can do on them, I suppose ultimately we could have worked towards it. We could have got to a point where we could maybe support, you know, loadable programs, so other developers could develop clever ideas for it, sort of more advanced alarm clocks and that kind of thing. But that part never really happened. It kind of was what it was. And then, of course, we moved on because we were getting from Z80 sort of old school machines to the PC era at that sort of time. I mean, obviously we'd already done 1512 and 1640 by that stage, but we were getting more and more heavily involved in that. So that's where the money was. I mean, we were a very small staff. The engineering for the computing side of things, there was only, I don't know how many people, maybe 20 people in total doing it. There weren't a lot of engineers for doing lots of parallel development, so we had to focus on what we thought was going to make money.
I think you're quite right. I mean, even if I look back, I could see Amstrad was an innovator in the market, in that there were some quite crazy things that hit the shelves. One of them was I think at the time almost it brought in my mind, this Jetsons era of gadgetry, and that was the emailer phone, which was you know, right at I suppose at the cusp of the internet becoming more, you know, widespread. Can you tell us about that and how that led into I think there was also the video phone that came following that?
Well, I mean, basically speaking, engineering director at the time was a guy called Bob Watkins, and he pushed this idea. He had this idea that there was an untapped audience of people might want to be able to send and receive email, because that was how people were now starting to communicate. But they didn't want the huge or the cost of the huge complexity of a big old desktop machine. There weren't that many laptops then. A desktop machine and all the complexity of trying to bolt a modem onto it, wire up to the phone line, all that stuff. They just wanted a solution that would allow them to do it. So it was known as, well, we called it BSI, and most people understood that to mean Bob's idea. Although outside the company, when anyone said, "Oh, BSI, what's that?" It was Bob's splendid idea. But the idea, not everyone was entirely convinced that there was sufficient market for this sort of thing. What people didn't appreciate was that at the time, and even now, mobile phones at several hundred quid's worth of electronics are sold to you for like 20 quid a month or something. So, but you're bound to a contract. So ultimately you end up paying the several hundred quid that it actually costs, and then some on beyond that. And people accepted that business model for mobiles. So the way it worked was it used to make one call a day to, well, not a premium rate number, but a higher rate number, which cost the user 12p per day. Only the electronics, we sold it to them for about a third of the actual cost to us of the electronics. So on our sort of economics, when we did the sort of profiles of how much these things were going to cost, it was something like the break-even point for us, as long as the person carried on using it. Once they'd used it for something like 14 or 18 months, then the money that was paying the 12p per day it was paying, or our fraction, we only got for like 5p of that, our part of that would then start to pay us profit. So effectively, we were dug in a deep hole. I mean, when we sold, I don't know, 10, well, 50,000, 100,000 of these things, I don't know how many, but, and each one was a huge loss for us until it had been used for that time, at which point it started to pay us a little bit of profit. Sort of media pundits, technical media pundits at the time said, what, they're expecting the end user to pay 12p a day just to be able to do email, when I've got this £1,500 desktop PC here and a £250 modem, and I can do email for free. But they kind of missed the point that we were selling them a 50 quid piece of electronics and we're charging 12p a day, and we didn't actually make any profit out of that until 14 or 18 months ahead. The impression that they were giving were that we were ripping people off, whereas actually all we were trying to do was to widen the access to email for the whole audience who wouldn't otherwise have it. Then we did things like we put a Spectrum emulator in it, so you can play Spectrum games on it and stuff. So anyway, the first model was done in the late 90s, I think it was, and it had a Sharp ARM7 chip in it. But anyway, Sharp, after a while, said, we're going to discontinue that chip. So we had to re-engineer it. So we did a second one with a higher spec version of the same Sharp chip. Because broadband, this was around the turn of the millennium, so broadband was starting to be a thing for people, but mainly only in cities and things. So there wasn't like countrywide coverage of broadband. We looked at the possibility of doing video, and again, who knew whether video phones would ever take off? Says us two having a video conversation right now. Anyway, it's now sort of like an everyday thing, and everyone, you know, you FaceTime your friends and your family. I mean, everyone takes it as accepted to do video calling, but back then it was like, it was the next era sort of thing. People never thought, oh, what, you could actually do a video call. So there was broadband, and you could, as this proves, we could do high res video calling over broadband. But the problem is most people didn't have broadband. So what we tried to do was to make a device that just had a modem in. It was the fastest modem you could get at that stage, which was 56,000 bits per second. But to try and get MPEG-4 encoded video and audio over that channel in sufficient resolution to actually see what was going on was a bit of a trick. So we found a company in India who had developed stacks for doing G729 audio and MPEG-4 video over a low rate audio modem link. But they said, oh, right, we've developed this, but it's developed and it runs on Linux. So if you're going to use it, you're going to need a platform that runs Linux, which our machines up to this stage were ARM7 based. And I don't know if you know, but to run Linux, you need a protected memory management unit. And only ARM9 has that. So we then had to trade up to an ARM9, but we also, to do the real-time video decompression, compression and then decompression, we chose it's an ARM9 and it's also a C5XX DSP for mathematical processing, which is what you need for video audio encoding. So the solution was a Linux computer, but with a powerful DSP to do the audio and video codec, and running Linux. So sure, we'd done ARM work at this stage, but only one person on our team had any experience of doing Linux. And so overnight, all of us, there was about 5 or 6 of us doing this. We had to train to be Linux system developers, so to write kernel drivers and things. So we went on training courses which were rubbish and didn't really teach us much, but the guy that I'd employed called Mike, he taught the rest of us how to do it. And so we all got into writing all this stuff on Linux. And so we made that machine that you've seen, the color video phone machine. To try and make money out of it, we were using some sort of premium rate number for the connection, which was it would cost the user £1 or something, or 50p or £1 to do a video call, and that's stupid amounts of money. I mean, you could get by with 10 or 12p a day for doing email and checking on other stuff, but to charge that amount of money, I mean, who's going to pay £1 to have a really crap video call that looks like you know, a war report from Afghanistan, where you can't even see the reporter, it's just all sort of mosaic blobs, which was pretty much what the video phone delivered. So sadly, it was a bit of a plot that failed. What we should have done probably was held out for broadband development and then done it as, well, just like we're talking now, so that you could have do sort of full res video and stuff. But anyways, it was an interesting technical development. It broadened my skills. I mean, I'm still doing Linux to this day, it was a useful thing to get involved in. That was actually an aspect of the whole job at Amstrad, was I have a wide range. I know a lot of things in a little detail, and things like DSP work and Linux work and things are things I have the skill from, just because of all those weird and wonderful things we did at Amstrad. But yeah, in terms of actual saleable product, it probably wasn't the best thing we ever did.
What I'm learning through this conversation is that Amstrad very much were ahead of the game, and a lot of the ideas were there, just that the infrastructure or the willingness for people to adopt it just wasn't quite there yet. It's almost like if those ideas had happened just a couple of years later and those products had been introduced at that time, there would have been a much different take on it. But I think you know, certainly can't take away from Amstrad the ideas to innovate and push and try new things. As you say, not all of them were successful, but there must have been projects that maybe even not commercially successful, but you were very proud of those. Can you tell us some of those?
Yeah, well, what I think the best thing I ever did was I was the project manager for the PDA600 handwriting driven computer. That when we did it in partnership with a company called the Eden Group, who were based in Macclesfield, and when they first came along to our office and said, we've got this idea for like a thing like a Filofax, but you can actually write on it. It was unheard of that a computer could actually recognize handwriting. I mean, admittedly, on the PDA600, it was non-cursive handwriting, so you couldn't do joined up writing. You had to write each letter in a little box, and then it would take that pattern and it would go and do pattern recognition on that. I mean, it's funny because my day job these days, I actually develop the modules that will drive cars on their own, which is all about sort of intensive video processing and things. And in that is things like pattern recognition. And it is an insanely complicated, hard thing to do. I mean, now cars, just using the cameras on the car, it can look at what it's seeing outside, and it can recognize everything in the environment and say, oh, that's a tree, that's a dog, that's a bicycle or whatever. But it's using insane amounts of computing power to do that. Yet this was back before the millennium, and it was a little handheld device, and you could write on it and it could recognize your writing with a verb.
There we are.
Notice how the lovely sort of soft coating on the outside has all gone.
Indeed, it has. Yeah, this is a particularly, shall we say, unloved or maybe just weathered example. But yeah, it's actually still remarkably compact and quite small and quite easy to hold in your hand.
Yeah, I've got several of those in a box in my loft actually. Some of them in actually better. In fact, actually, I should arrange at some point, dig them out and send them to you or something. You probably make more use than I ever would. But anyway, that device that was a really, really clever piece of electronics. I mean, admittedly, it wasn't Amstrad who developed it; it was the Eden Group who developed it. But we tried to industrialize it. So they were very smart guys in terms of software development and the actual electronic design, but they couldn't make it in a form that they could make like 10 or 50 or 100,000 units of. So we applied all of our manufacturing skills to take that design and try and make a device that was usable and saleable, and you can make just any number of them, as many as you like. Unfortunately, what happened with that device was of the component cost of that thing, 1/3 of it was the cost of the screen and the Indian tin oxide touch panel on top. And so, unfortunately, the consequence of that was that we couldn't sell it cheap. It would have been great if we could have made those and sold them for like 99 quid each or something, but we couldn't because it was actually costing us 99 quid in terms of components. And there's this well-known calculation in the industry about when you apply all of the shipping, the manufacturing, the duties, the import taxes, the VAT, the retailer profit and things, you sell things for 3 times what they cost to make. So if something costs £100 in components and all of the cost to actually get it here landed in the UK, then it has to sell at £300. Otherwise, no one makes any money. So it is sold at £299. Unfortunately, that was just a little bit too much. I mean, it was a great idea, and filofaxes were the thing back then. So everyone, all your yuppies, they all had a filofax, and the idea that you could give them an electronic filofax looked great. But £299 even at the turn of the millennium, I mean, that's probably the equivalent of £399 at least now. Maybe £450 even. And would you pay that for a small handheld thing? Well, people do for mobile phones actually, but it wasn't quite in the league of a mobile phone. So it was a brilliant piece of innovative electronics, and it really deserved to be a real success. Unfortunately, we thought that was the case. So I can't remember if it was either 45,000 or 90,000 kits components. And remember, these are 100 quid. So we invested something like £10 million in component costs for the kits to build these things, released it and said it was going to be £299, and no one bought them. So we were left with £10 million of inventory that we couldn't make use of. So in the end, we shipped it to the UK and we sold them, all the kits, to someone for 45 quid a time. So we made a 55 quid loss per unit. So we ended up losing about 5 million quid on that.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
And the amazing thing, sorry, Cliff, the amazing thing is you didn't create something bad, because it was only, I think, again, people will shoot me down here, but I think it was a couple of years later that Apple, of course, brought out the Newton.
It was less than that. We beat Apple by 3 months. So that came out, we brought it to market, and you could buy it in Dixon's. It was 3 months before the Apple Newton then came out. And of course, the Apple Newton, it could do cursive. But again, no one bought the Apple Newton. Who's ever seen an Apple Newton these days? But what did happen was these things were just like a stepping stone to the next obvious development. Around that time, we wanted to get into mobile phones, and there was a failing mobile phone development company in Denmark called Dankor, and Alan bought the company for 6 million quid, I think it was, with 150 very smart Danish engineers who were developing mobile phone GPRS mobile phone technology. And so one of the things we said was, another thing is the PDA600, we started to develop a follow-on model called the PDA700. And what it was going to be that same machine, but it had a radio pager in it. And so the radio pager could both do radio paging, so flash on the screen, say you need to get to the operating theatre or whatever it was that you had to get the message to someone. We partnered with Hutchinson Telecom, who became Orange, the big mobile phone company, and we were going to use their network to send also generic like traffic information, weather information, and then the device was going to have like a map of England, and it was going to show you on the map where the weather were, you know, what the weather was, where the traffic blockages were, that sort of thing. So that was the next step for that. And then having bought this mobile phone company, the very next step was to make a device which was both a touchscreen driven organizer sort of thing, combined with a mobile phone. Now, there was a device from Nokia called the Nokia 9000 communicator, which was like this big brick phone, and you opened it up and there was a little keyboard and there was this LCD screen. But we were going to do a device which was like a touchscreen device and a mobile phone, i.e. today's smartphone. Only the Robert Bosch company in Germany, they were also keen to get into mobile phones, and they approached Alan and they bought Dangle from us for 85 million. So in something like 3 years or 2 years, a £6 million investment Alan made became an £85 million return. So he couldn't pass it up. So unfortunately, that's where we broke company and the thing never happened. But that would have been really interesting.
I mean, thinking about Alan could have had the first, could have beat the iPhone to market, couldn't he?
Yeah, that. And also another thing that happened, Alan, again, we had quite a relationship with Samsung in Korea. In fact, I once went to Samsung in Korea and got the drunkest I've ever been in my entire life. It took me about 3 days to stop vomiting. But anyway, we had this relationship with Samsung, and Alan had been on one of his sort of regular visits over to South Korea to see them. And he came back and he bought this thing, which was like a memory stick that you could put some audio tracks on to play back. The only thing is it was 64 megabytes, and an encoded MP3 audio track was about 3 or 4 megabytes. So basically you could get about 15 or 20 tracks on this thing. Also, there was no broadband at this stage. So to download a 3 megabyte track, one single MP3 track onto this thing over a normal high-speed modem, like a 14,400 or even a 56,000 bit modem, it would take like 2.5 hours to download a track. So I actually said to Alan, no, there's no interest in this. We don't do this. And yet we could have got in at the start of MP3 players and iPlayers. So unfortunately, that was another thing that we could have been much bigger in certain areas. Like if we said, oh yeah, all we need is for the broadband thing that's starting to appear to catch on, then you'll be able to load this thing up quicker. And by Moore's law, the capacity is going to double every 18 months. So in a few, maybe in 3 years' time or so, there's going to be sufficient capacity for this thing to be sensible. And it would have been brilliant. We could have done so we could have done a touchscreen smartphone. We could have done a MP3 player, and we didn't do either of those things for circumstances that occurred.
I mean, there were things obviously that Amstrad really hit the mark with, and one of those things, as you mentioned earlier, was the PC range. And they at one point they were literally flying off the shelves across Europe. I mean, to what do you attribute the success of the Amstrad PCW range?
I think the biggest shock people had with the PCW8256 when we launched it, I remember going, we used to do a huge spread at the Personal Computer World Show in Olympia each year, and it was always in the autumn, so like October time. I mean, it was basically to showcase things that would be on sale for Christmas. And I remember that year that we launched the PCW8256, and people coming up, and we had the big banners saying, you get the monitor, the printer, keyboard, like the entire system. It's the word processor. You can do all your office tasks on it. And it was it 299? I think it was 399, wasn't it, for that whole thing? But people couldn't believe it. I mean, this was an era when an IBM PC cost £2,500. And so for 400 quid, you could buy a package which wasn't just the computer, but was the printer and everything you needed for your office. So lots of little businesses who just wanted to do a bit of kind of bookkeeping and word processing stuff in a little back office. This was the perfect system. So that was hugely successful. It wasn't as successful as the PC 1512 and 1640 though. I mean, in fact, my backdrop here behind my head, that is a PC 1512 circuit board. I just found a picture on the internet, but the fact is, this is the epitome of what Amstrad does. So that £2,500 IBM PC, it had about 100 TTL 74 series TTL chips all wired up on the board, and it was sort of a huge cost to manufacture, huge component cost. And basically what Medj did was he took most of that logic and shrunk it into a gate array. People think, oh, Amstrad, they're a bit sort of tacky, sort of low end stuff. Actually, no, I would claim we weren't. I'd claim we were a very successful company. And what we did was we used the very latest technologies basically to reduce price, to make things more accessible and sell more of them. And so the 1512, well, actually, even that wasn't the most successful. The most successful was the one which then upgraded the graphics to EGA. This had CGA and an extra special color mode. But the 1640 had EGA graphics. And at one stage we were making 50,000, well, selling 50,000 a month, and we were making £100 profit per unit on all of those sales. So that was a phenomenal, I mean, the value of Amstrad shares, Alan owned just over 50% of the shares, and the company was valued at 2 billion.
So how prolific were those PCs in the European market then? Was it literally, as I remember at the time, literally everybody had them?
Our stuff was fairly pervasive all over the place. The 8256, you saw it everywhere. It was widespread, because there's a whole that level just below sort of corporates where they would just pay endless money for IBM because you never got fired for buying IBM, as the saying used to go. I mean, there was only that many businesses in the UK. I mean, what, 5 million, 10 million businesses probably, and most of them probably had at least one of these things, and many of them. Unfortunately, we had a problem with our hard disk drives in those units, and not through no fault of our own, our name got tainted as unreliable business machines, because we sold. I mean, companies didn't really care who made the equipment or anything. They just wanted it to be reliable. And if you start, say, storing your employee database or your salary records or whatever on a machine, and then you come in one day and find that, oh dear, the hard drive seems to have lost that, that is not a good scenario. And that only has to happen a few times, and you start to get really tainted. And people would just say, well, don't trust Amstrad, don't buy them. And that is unfortunately what happened. I mean, we then took both those hard drive companies to court, and we won in both cases. But it's something we never really got back from. So I mean, one thing we were hugely successful in was our ALT 286 and ALT 386 laptops. We were the market leader across the whole of Europe for laptops for a long time with those models. They were really brilliant designs.
Did the sort of, I suppose, stigma that surrounded the reliability issues with the the PCs. Did that sort of start to spell the end of the Amstrad era, and what transitioned into that kind of sale of Amstrad to B Sky B? I mean, how did that come about, that transition?
Well, the satellite thing in part was when Rupert Murdoch took an option on the Astra 1A satellite, he bought broadcast capacity on the transponders, but didn't have the infrastructure to actually deliver that into homes. So he came along to Alan and said, well, we need satellite receivers. And it's the fastest project we ever did. Went from requirements, the original specification, to actual manufacture in 6 months. And so we delivered a system for them. So that was a good first step. It just, over time, it became more and more of our business. The PCW 8256 had its day, but there came a point when people wanted all the facilities of a complete computer, an IBM PC compatible. Then we therefore concentrated on the satellite business, because that is something where we were kind of in competition with the other suppliers to Sky, but we then tried to get more and more of that business. And then Alan got to the stage where he was thinking of retiring, but he built up this company, and there was like 100 or more, I can't remember exactly how many employees, and he just wanted to give them a safe future. So he effectively sold Amstrad to Sky as Sky's hardware development department for satellite receivers and recorders. I spent 25 years getting involved in every kind of interesting technology, new ideas. Like I say, Alan would come in each year. Oh, Tamagotchis, do you remember those things you had to poke buttons? He brought one of those back from Japan before they were a thing here, and said, could we make one of these? I did a bit of research about that, but we couldn't make it sort of economically. But that's just one idea. I mean, it was just full of a continuous rolling thing of a new idea. We'd then he'd see it, we'd start making one. It would be almost everything took 2 years to run. So it's sort of like in 2 year cycle, although sometimes things were happening in parallel, but it was different and interesting new ideas where we were doing something no one else was doing. We were getting sort of a new market, or we were getting a big part of a developing market. And that was all really interesting stuff. And then we became a boring satellite box maker, doing only sort of support for Sky.
I suppose I should ask, I was going to ask this at the beginning, and I didn't. I wanted to hold it towards the end of the interview, but what was life under Alan Sugar like? Because we obviously only know the personality, the caricature, if you like, of Alan that we see on TV, but what was he actually like?
Yeah, I mean, he is aggressive, like he comes on. It's kind of an act, what you see on the telly. He's being deliberately aggressive and unpleasant to these people. But I mean, that's kind of what all modern TV shows are all about, jeopardy, and it brings jeopardy into the thing. So it's kind of a bit of an act, but he is a bit like that. And I've been in meetings where he'll scream for an hour using F word every second word, talking about why we're using a 2 cent capacitor when we should be using a 1 cent capacitor. And it matters, because if you're making like 2 million products, 1 cent times 2 million is £20,000 or something, is it? I can't do the sum in my head. That's a game age for you. But anyway, it matters. Every last cent in the thing matters. So he can be really gruff and abrasive, but he's also actually a really nice bloke. And he's very part of the rough exterior, I believe, comes across because he's actually a bit shy, and it's sort of putting on the front to hide behind to a certain extent. Just my personal opinion. And he's also very sort of caring. I was quite ill at one stage, and he arranged for me to see his doctor and pay for me to go to Harley Street to have some procedures and things. So in that sense, he's not what he looks like on the outside. A lot of people misunderstand that and think, oh, he's just this kind of, like, East End thug. But he isn't. He's also extraordinarily smart. He's got this real trick that maybe it's not. He doesn't need to employ it these days. But we would call people in to talk about some new product or something we were doing, and they would try and blind him with science, except that he knew every last detail. He gives this impression of, oh, I'm just the executive, what do I know about it? And he knows every last technical detail, and that can undermine people. It's quite a clever skill. So yeah, he's an okay bloke, I think. But I don't think that really comes across ever when you see him.
No, and I think that is part, as you say, about the persona that he's portraying that mates into this this bit of East End boy, rough, done good, you know. But yeah, it's always good to get the sort of, I suppose, the glimpse behind the curtain. If you were to go back to Amstrad, let's just say we could magically teleport you back, and you could revisit one product and do it differently, what would it be?
I think, well, there's various things. I mean, the games computers, we could have carried on and got heavily into it. I mean, carried on alongside your Nintendos and your Sonys, and Microsoft with their Xbox and things. There was the PCW, when we made the 464, 664, 6128, and then we did 8256, those CPC 464X, they had a code name of Arnold, which was to put people off. Arnold was the name of the guy in charge of General Electronics or something. So it was to try and, it's also an anagram of the name Roland. What we did was, when we did the 8256, we looked at making one which had colour in the graphics, and then adding things like sprites and things. And it was a code named Ant, which was Arnold number 2. And so there could have been that. Then we did the, CPC 464 and 6128 plus models, along with the GX 4000 console machine. But the problem was it was all too little too late. At this stage, the Atari ST and the Amiga were appearing, and we just basically didn't keep up with them. If we had, we might have got into the console market, and then there could have been a 16-bit model of that, and a 32-bit model of that, and so on. And we could have been up there with PS1s and Xboxes and things, and got into that market more heavily than we did. So it's a bit of a shame we never pursued it. But the problem was, something like that would have taken a huge amount of monetary investment on a gamble. And again, it's basically Alan's money, so it's something he didn't want to risk, obviously.
No, I must admit, I missed out on the GX models. I always quite fancied the, I think I saw Burning Rubber running on a GX. I thought that looks pretty good. If that had come out either a few years earlier, or they, maybe thrown a bit more at it and to tackle the incoming consoles, it would have been a different story again. But if you happen to have a GX up in the loft, you can gladly say.
I have got one as well. That Burning Rubber, that was done by Ocean in Manchester. And because it was our launch cartridge, we wanted to supply it with every console. It needed to be delivered to the factory for start of production on a certain day. And we were getting closer and closer to that deadline. And we basically went and sat there in their office for 48 hours. The actual Ocean programmer who was doing it, he was just using those caffeine pills, Poplus or whatever. He was just popping them endlessly to stay awake, to try and get this thing done so we could take it and then drive back. So we'd actually been awake 48 hours. And so then we had to drive back to Brentwood to deliver it. And it was a thunderstorm, and I drove back, and I'd been awake 48 hours. So I was trying to battle to stay awake, driving down the motorway in a thunderstorm just to get some games cartridge back into production. But that was the kind of fun things we did in those days. Yeah, that was a really good game. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, no, I loved it. And how ironic that you were racing down the motorway to deliver a Burning Rubber game.
Oh yes, that didn't stop me. Yeah, good point.
I suppose the last question I really have for you, Cliff, and it's been absolutely fascinating to discuss this stuff. But what keeps your interest today? What do you do for fun now?
Well, if anyone knows about AVR microcontrollers, if you go onto the main support forum for those and find who's the top poster on there, you'll find it's me. So I'm actually sort of really interested in just 8-bit micros, and I would recommend anyone who, well, actually these days, if anyone wants to get into programming micros and things, you're bound to buy an Arduino, and that is bound to have, most of them have an Atmel AVR at the core of them. So you're going to learn about it anyway. But yeah, I've got like 100,000 or 110,000 posts on that forum, doing support over since 2005 or something, just answering people's questions about them. So that interests me. My other main interest is aviation. I mean, I've got a pilot's license, although it's lapsed these days, but I've done a bit of flying in the past, and highlight of my entire life was the day my wife used to enter every last sort of competition at all the air shows we go to. And one year we won the Blenheim Restoration Society prize. So the lady phoned up and said, right, we've got several prizes, so you could do this, that, or the other. And the options were something like flight in a Lancaster, which that would have been really good, fly a Spitfire. So about 3 nanoseconds later, I said, yeah, I'll take that, please. And so I went to Duxford, to the old aircraft company there, and flew in their dual seat Spitfire. And because I've got a pilot's license, the pilot let me fly it. So I have actually flown the Spitfire. So that, I would say, if you're interested in aviation, it doesn't get any better than flying a Spitfire. It's really amazing in terms of flying an aircraft. I mean, it is so responsive. It's just such a joy to fly the thing. So yeah, that's kind of my interest.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for your time in the shack today, Cliff. It's been a real pleasure talking with you. If you do decide that you want to launch a new 8-bit micro, by the way, to carry on the CPC legacy, make sure you let me know in the first place, please. Cliff, thank you so much indeed. And that about wraps it up for this episode too. And I do hope you've enjoyed it. As always, if you like the channel, please like and subscribe and hit the bell for notifications of new content. If you'd like to support the channel or have something you'd like to donate and see featured, check out our website for details on how to do so. Please leave your comments below, as we always love to read them. And until next time in the shack, it's goodbye from me and goodbye from Cliff.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Scott.